What's up, everybody? Nate here. So Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary for the United States, just admitted that she was very wrong about inflation in the United States, how high it would get, and the impact it would have on our economy in general. This comes after Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell recently retired the phrase transitory, and President of the United States, Joe Biden, made similar remarks regarding inflation in our economy. Now, by early June 2022, inflation is raging not only in the United States, but across the world. And even though all of these big political figures say they were wrong about inflation, it is now their responsibility to sort of right the ship and get inflation under control and get our economy back on track. But the real question we need to ask ourselves is this: were all of these government officials really wrong about inflation? Did they make an honest mistake considering the factors of inflation, or did they know what was going to happen in our economy and straight up lied to us about inflation and all of its impacts? Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, and President of the United States, Joe Biden, all lied to us about inflation. And today we're going to go over the two major lies that all of these figures told us, why they are lying to us about inflation, and why this is important to know for the future of our economy. But before I get into all of that, do me a quick favor and hit, smash, or destroy that thumbs up button below and ring that notification bell too. Both of those two things are completely free, and they help to show me that you like this video and that you want to see even more just like it. Thank you so much for doing that. And now I want to first talk about inflation. What exactly is inflation, and why is it so high right now? Well, inflation is simply when a government prints a whole lot of money. They are increasing the monetary supply, and when you increase the monetary supply, there are a lot of reasons to do that. The main one is for the Federal Reserve to print money and then give it out to the rest of our economy. That money kind of trickles down through everybody, through businesses, and then to the American people. When you print money, though, it sort of devalues all of the current dollars that are out there, because now there's a lot more money, which means more people have access to it. And when people get a whole lot of money, they typically go out and spend that money. They typically go out and buy things. These things are consumer products, which businesses have to produce. And as people buy more, well, businesses can't keep up. They can't exactly produce all of the same things because people have a lot more money. If they produce the same amount of things, well, then Americans would be running out. We would have empty shelves because businesses aren't making more. So with consumers buying more, that signals to businesses that they need to produce more, but that all comes at a cost to them as well. They can't produce more just for free. They have to be able to charge more because they have to take on more risks, like hiring more workers, building more factories, and expanding their supply chain. And that's exactly what they have done over the last 2 years. They eventually trickle all of those additional costs down to the consumer, so they charge more, but you also pay more, so it all eventually evens out. Now, this whole inflation issue really started all the way back at the beginning of the pandemic, so March of 2020, not the middle parts of 2021 like a lot of experts and the Federal Reserve wants you to believe. Like I said, the main cause of inflation is when the government prints a whole lot of money, and we saw that in 2020 as the United States Federal Reserve printed trillions of dollars in stimulus. In fact, between 2020 and 2021, around 80% of all US dollars that are currently in circulation were printed those 2 years. If you look at the Federal Reserve's M1 money supply, which basically covers all assets and money-related assets in the United States, you can see that there was about $3 trillion available by the early parts of 2020. However, by the end of 2021, we now have over $20 trillion in circulation. That is a historic jump, and with that, you're going to have historic inflation. But there was also something else that happened during that time: the pandemic. The only reason the Federal Reserve printed all of that money that suddenly is because the United States was undergoing a pandemic. Now, we needed a whole bunch of money because millions of Americans were out of work. We had economic lockdowns and social distancing orders, so nobody was really able to work and get a paycheck. And if no American has any money, then how are they supposed to buy things? 70% of our GDP is measured through consumer spending, so if Americans aren't spending money, then businesses aren't getting any money either. either. They can't grow, which means they can't pay their current employees. So if Americans aren't spending, everything in our economy goes down. And that was a serious worry during the time. The United States federal government immediately started to pass bills like the CARES Act and then the HEROES Act, which didn't actually go through, but would supply trillions of dollars to everyday Americans and businesses. That was a whole lot of money all at once. And like I said, this was fear that Americans were gonna stop spending. We didn't know how long the pandemic was going to go on for. And in addition to that, we had massive supply chain issues. All of a sudden, not only the United States basically stopped working, but countries like China and countries in Europe all basically stopped working for a very long time, so nothing was getting produced. Americans were going to the stores, but everything was out. I mean, I'm sure you remember the toilet paper pandemonium of 2020. I remember going to the store and literally seeing empty shelves of toilet paper because Americans thought they were not going to have anything to clean themselves in the bathroom. And that created panic buying for a lot of other products. But we were running out of things very quickly, and this is because of all of that stimulus money. People weren't working, but now that the federal government was giving them all of this money, they could still go out and buy at the same rate, but we weren't producing at the same rate either. So we ran into some high inflation right away. And sometimes you'll have that inflation too. When you get inflation based on the supply chain, well, that kind of comes and goes. If something in the supply chain is bottlenecked and you have a scarcity, well, that's going to create a supply and demand problem. And if that good or service is in high demand, but there is not a lot, which means it's scarce, you're going to have a really high price for that item. If the opposite happens, well, then you'll have de-inflation. If nobody wants it, so it's not in demand at all, but you have a ton of that product, well, the price is going to be low. It's not that people can't buy it, it's that they don't want to. So both of those factors were kind of putting pressure on our economy. And not only that, but the Federal Reserve went in and bailed out the stock market. They started to buy hundreds of billions of dollars every single month in stocks and bonds. They wanted to push the stock market up because with people not buying anything, businesses were going to suffer. So they wanted to offer liquidity so people could continue to invest. There was a big shock to our economy at the time. It actually caused a recession in the United States, but because of all of the money printing, this was the shortest recession in American history. So basically all of that money printing worked. It kept the United States growing, it helped us out through the pandemic, and it gave money to a lot of families and businesses that really needed it. But that was only in the short term, and as soon as the money printer turned off by mid-2021, we started to run into some problems, mainly inflation. Now inflation is raging everywhere, and we have seen through the longest time that the Federal Reserve and President Joe Biden and Treasury Secretary Yellen have said that this is no big deal. Which brings me to the first lie that they told us about inflation. Now, the way that we measure inflation in the United States is something called the Consumer Price Index. Basically, this is a basket of all of our industries and markets in the United States where we measure how the average price is changing month over month. If it's going up, then that shows that you have inflation. If it's going down, then you're in a deflationary economy. But there are two major numbers on that Consumer Price Index. You have headline inflation. So headline inflation is everything. It's going to be all of your goods and services and the average price of how they're going up or down every single month. And then you have core inflation. Core inflation is actually the gauge that the Federal Reserve uses when they measure inflation in our economy. Core inflation takes out volatile industries like food and energy. And the reason the Federal Reserve uses those is because those industries change in price so often that it could throw off the entire Consumer Price Index. But the problem is this is how they measure inflation and how they measure their monetary policy. If core inflation is really low because they're not looking at energy prices or food, well, then they can go crazy with their monetary policy. But here is the issue. Americans still spend a ton of money on food and energy. Energy includes your electric bill and gas prices. The Federal Reserve basically just turns a blind eye to those. So when they say inflation is low and inflation is going down, you have to consider what they're looking at. Are they looking at headline inflation or are they looking at their core inflation numbers? And that is going to be a problem for everyday Americans going forward, because if they assume that the Federal Reserve has everything under control, well, they don't know that they're looking at core inflation numbers. So everything in our economy might still be going up, especially food and energy, but the Fed doesn't see it that way. They only see numbers going down because they're not looking at the volatile industries. So that is number one. And the second thing that the Federal Reserve and other government officials have been lying to us about when it comes to inflation is the true cause of inflation. They have said time and time again that inflation is transitory. Once all of our supply chain issues end from the pandemic, countries around the world open up, businesses open back up, we will have lower inflation. And that is partially true. Yes, when all those supply chain issues go away, then inflation will come down, but only slightly. You're not going to see widespread lowering of inflation because the true cause of inflation is money printing. Now that you have all of that money in our economy, businesses have all of this additional liquidity, well, they're going to go out and spend all of that cash. And that creates a problem with the rest of our economy because you have way too much demand. Sure, eventually those supply chain issues will go away. They can't possibly last forever, but we don't know how long that's going to go on for. So saying that the supply chain issues are the problem and the solution for everything is just not true. That takes away from the real issue that you have $20 trillion in your economy that's just flowing around everywhere. This is why the Federal Reserve is now starting to raise its benchmark interest rates up from 0% to now nearly 0.75%. They want to eliminate a lot of that demand in our economy, but the problem is half of our inflation issue is caused by supply chain problems, which the Fed can't fix and which the federal government can't fix outside of the US. I mean, raising interest rates will definitely help, so they need to do that. Wall Street agrees that they need to get aggressive with inflation, but most experts also agree that the Federal Reserve should have gotten way more aggressive with inflation almost 8 months ago. The Federal Reserve has been talking about raising interest rates and pulling their stimulus from Wall Street and pulling their stimulus from the rest of the United States for a very long time now, since about maybe October or November of 2021, but they didn't actually start doing something, raising their interest rates and selling off a lot of their assets from Wall Street until March and then May of 2022. That meant that inflation basically went unchecked for around 3 or 4 months, which was a huge problem. They are now so far behind on inflation that they have to get very aggressive with their interest rates. So then that begs the question, why? Why exactly did the Federal Reserve lie to the American people about inflation? Well, in their eyes, lying is probably the best scenario. I mean, politicians do it all the time, and unfortunately, government does it a lot too. The Federal Reserve, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and our president do not want to be the bad guys when it comes to inflation. That's because all of these positions are elected. And the American people or Congress could immediately push all of those figures out if they need to. So they don't want to crash the economy. They don't want to do the thing that's right and raise interest rates at the right time or prevent stimulus just to get our economy back on its feet. They don't want to be the bad guy because our economy might need to crash in order to get everything back to a normal level, but nobody wants to see that happen. You think the President of the United States can expect to be reelected if his entire economy crashes underneath him? Of course not. So they do the easy thing. They institute easy money policies. They bring interest rates down and they print a whole bunch of extra money. That makes everything okay right now, and that's what they want. Not only that, but they don't want to scare the American consumer. You think if they came out in November of 2021 and said inflation is terrible, our economy is crashing, so nobody should spend any money, everybody needs to save right now. Well, the American people would start saving. They'd be scared to spend money, and that is bad for our economy too. So they do have a responsibility to kind of walk the line between being truthful and outright lying. But they have been outright lying for a very long time now. It's only until May of 2022 that they're just now starting to come out and say, we were wrong about inflation. And also, the Federal Reserve and the United States government needs inflation in order to survive. I don't know if you've checked on it lately, but the United States debt clock is ticking out of control. We have over $30 trillion in federal debt, and that is growing every single second, every single minute, and every single day. If we had no inflation, meaning that the value of our money actually went up or stayed the same over time, then all of those bills would actually get more expensive over time. You would now need more money to pay off all of those bills. So you kind of get into a cycle where you have to continue to print more and more. That's exactly what the Federal Reserve does though. Because we have an inflationary economy, the Fed prints a whole lot of money and then it gives that money to the federal government. Federal government then takes all that money and uses it to pay down its debt, but all of that debt is now a lot cheaper because inflation is raging so high. All of the money and all of the value and the buying power of those dollars goes down, so they just print a whole lot more. Because a lot of that debt is set, new debt is growing, but some of that debt has already been set, well, now you're paying it off with cheaper dollars. So the government needs to have inflation. So in general, we're always going to see inflation in the United States. The Fed isn't going to make inflation disappear, they're just going to lower it to an acceptable level. Now, why exactly is all of this super important for the future of our economy? Well, number one, you need to know the true intentions of the Federal Reserve. You have to know why they exist in the first place. You have to know their role in our economy, because the fact of the matter is they're probably going to lie to us again. So what I'm saying is take everything the Federal Reserve says with a grain of salt. I'm not saying that they're outright lying to you, but they're definitely not always being truthful. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But if you solely put all of your faith in the Federal Reserve and you listen to everything that they say, well, then you might end up becoming a lot poorer because the Federal Reserve doesn't always have our best interests in heart when they make their monetary policy. And then number two, the Federal Reserve might make some pretty serious errors in the future. So if you totally believe that the Federal Reserve is on our side, and you believe that the Federal Reserve has been telling the truth about inflation all along, and that right now they just made a mistake, an honest mistake with inflation and monetary policies, well, then what's to say that they won't make a mistake in the future? Right now, they have said that their monetary policies may cause a slight recession, but most likely it won't, and they're going to be able to tighten, raise their interest rates, pull their economic stimulus without causing a serious recession in the United States. That's what they've said, and if you blindly listen to them, well, you might end up losing a whole lot of money in the future. They could make a mistake here. The stock market thinks this is possible. Other Americans believe this is possible. The Federal Reserve is not perfect. They could over-tighten. They could pull too much demand out at once. They could pull way too much of their stimulus, and that could all cause a recession. They are so focused on bringing down inflation right now that they're not really considering the rest of the United States economy, which means they're not considering you. What you need to do right now is take a good long look at your finances and watch what the Federal Reserve does next. Watch what they say. Watch how they phrase things, because we have seen a lot of this in the past. You have to create a solid financial plan today that is going to make you an economic winner no matter what happens. So if the Fed continues to be wrong about inflation, you have a plan in place. If everything is great and the Federal Reserve does not cause a recession and our economy starts growing again, then great, you also have a plan in place. That is why financial education is so important in 2022. But most importantly, your finances start with you. Don't expect the United States federal government, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department of the US to bail us out of this inflation issue anytime soon. If you want to beat inflation, well, then you have to do that on your own. The Federal Reserve is not going to do that for you because it's not really in their best interest. So in a nutshell, if you don't beat inflation, nobody else will. But now I want to hear from you on this issue. What do you think about the Federal Reserve essentially lying to us about inflation? Do you think they really just made a mistake and they have been truthful about inflation up to this point? Or do you believe that the Fed has been downright lying to us about inflation and the impact it would have on our economy? Whatever your thoughts are, leave a comment below before you go. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching, If you want to stay up to date with all of the top business and financial news from around the country, our team puts together a free daily newsletter, and you can subscribe to it by clicking the link in this corner right here. And if you want to stay up to date with me and everything else happening in the business and financial world, I'm putting out updates 7 days a week over here on this channel, and I've actually got another one ready for you right here, so be sure to check that out before you go. That is it for me, everybody. Be kind out there, and I'll see you all in the next one.